Hail Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes. We probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And today we're talking about the evolution of Boromir. I have to admit, the first time I read The Lord of the Rings as a youth, I just saw Boromir as the guy who broke up the Fellowship. Too bad his brother didn't make the trip. But in subsequent readings, and as I got older, I found myself having a lot more sympathy for Boromir and his character arc. And then, of course, when Jackson's trilogy came out, Sean Bean just nailed it as this flawed but well-meaning human being. And his emotional redemption and final confessional with Aragorn are certainly present in the source material. Here's the passage from The Two Towers. You'll see it has a lot of similarities to Boromir's death scene in The Fellowship of the Ring. A mile, maybe, from Parth Galen, in a little glade not far from the lake, he found Boromir. He was sitting with his back to a great tree, as if he was resting. But Aragorn saw that he was pierced with many black-feathered arrows. His sword was still in his hand, but it was broken near the hilt. His horn, cloven in two, was at his side. Many orcs lay slain, piled all about him and at his feet. Aragorn knelt beside him. Boromir opened his eyes and strove to speak. At last, slow words came. "I tried to take the ring from Frodo," he said. "I'm sorry. I have paid." His glance strayed to his fallen enemies. 20, at least, lay there. They have gone. The halflings. The orcs have taken them. I think they are not dead. Orcs bound them. He paused, and his eyes closed wearily. After a moment, he spoke again. "Farewell, Aragorn. Go to Minas Tirith and save my people. I have failed." "No," said Aragorn, taking his hand and kissing his brow. "You have conquered. Few have gained such a victory. Be at peace. Minas Tirith shall not fall." Boromir smiled. "Which way did they go? Was Frodo there?" said Aragorn. But Boromir did not speak again. "Alas," said Aragorn, "thus passes the heir of Denethor, Lord of the Tower of Guard. This is a bitter end. Now the company is all in ruin. It is I that have failed. Vain was Gandalf's trust in me. What shall I do now? Boromir has laid it on me to go to Minas Tirith, and my heart desires it. But where are the ring and the bearer? How shall I find them and save the quest from disaster?" He knelt for a while, bent with weeping, still clasping Boromir's hand. So it was that Legolas and Gimli found him. That last image, an emotionally overwhelmed Aragorn, kneeling amidst all of this carnage, weeping while holding Boromir's lifeless hand. And, of course, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli take time away from their pursuit of Merry and Pippin to give Boromir a proper funeral, complete with a sung eulogy. Aragorn sings the line, "His head so proud, his face so fair, his limbs they laid to rest, and Rauros, golden Rauros falls, bore him upon its breast." And so Boromir receives a fittingly heroic send-off. One line stands out to me in Boromir's final words. "I have failed." Yes, he's saying that he's failed to save Minas Tirith, hoping that Aragorn can carry on without him. But that line comes shortly after, "I tried to take the ring from Frodo." And I think of that line as a counterpoint to Galadriel's famous line after refusing Frodo's offer of the ring. "I pass the test." I think this is Boromir acknowledging that he failed this ultimate test of will. And it says something about him that in his final moments, he's not blaming circumstance or the Fellowship or even the orcs. He's blaming himself. He's his own worst critic. And Tolkien allows him to hear that line from Aragorn, Minas Tirith shall not fall, so that he can die with a smile on his lips. So undeniably, Tolkien gave Boromir a redemption arc. I think we can all agree on that. But that was not always the case. I was reading over The Treason of Isengard, one of the works containing Tolkien's notes. And Christopher Tolkien organizes it in an interesting way, in that he groups the notes by draft. So you can see from draft 1 to draft 4, for instance, the changes in the characters, their names, their motivations. And it's no surprise that several characters underwent major changes. I did a video about how Aragorn was once a hobbit named Trotter. Well, this video is focusing on Boromir's transformation. But before I read the Treason of Isengard quotes, I need to reference one other canonical event. And that's the disappearance and presumed death of the final king of Gondor before Aragorn, Eärnur. You might already know this, but just in case you don't, Eärnur was a soldier king. He preferred the battlefield. Never had a wife or any children. He gets into this personal feud with the Witch King, and even though Glorfindel told him the prophecy, no mortal man would ever destroy the Witch King. Around the year 2050 of the Third Age, he foolishly accepted a challenge from the Witch King against the advice of his steward, Mardil, rode off to Minas Morgul with a small retinue, and was never seen again. Mardil is left with a realm to run and no hereditary ruler to run it. This is from the appendices. So it was that no claimant to the crown could be found who was of pure blood, or whose claim all would allow. And all feared the memory of the kin strife, knowing that if any such dissension arose again, then Gondor would perish. Therefore, though the years lengthened, the steward, Mardil, continued to rule Gondor, and the crown of Elendil lay in the lap of King Eärnil in the houses of the dead, where Eärnur had left it. Each new steward indeed took office with the oath to hold rod and rule in the name of the king until he shall return. But these soon became words of ritual little heeded, for the stewards exercised all the power of the kings. Yet many in Gondor still believed that a king would indeed return in some time to come, and some remembered the ancient line of the north, which it was rumored still lived on in the shadows. But against such thoughts, the ruling stewards hardened their hearts. Nonetheless, the stewards never sat on the ancient throne, and they wore no crown and held no scepter. They bore a white rod only as the token of their office, and their banner was white without charge. But the royal banner had been sable, upon which was displayed a white tree in blossom beneath 7 stars. So we get the idea that the stewards enjoyed their power and were reluctant to give it up over the years, but they did abide by the rituals and traditions. They even had a part to play in Gondor's future before the death of Eärnur. I did a video on King Arvedui and his unsuccessful dealings with the Council of Gondor. But suffice to say, Eärnur's last ride marks the beginning of the prominence of the ruling stewards. And very importantly, the stewards were of Númenorian origin. This goes all the way to Denethor II, Boromir's father. Now, with that background, knowing what history Tolkien ultimately settled on, let's take it back a few drafts with the Treason of Isengard. You're going to hear Christopher Tolkien's notes, and then we're going to pick it up with the Council of Elrond. Note that Aragorn is still known as Trotter. Strider comes later. You'll also hear the word Tarkil. Tarkil is basically another word for a Númenorian. The whole of the last paragraph was struck through in pencil. The last words stand at the foot of a page, and the following page is lost. This is a misfortune, since a part of the earliest form of the history is lost with it. The text, when it takes up again, is complex. We are now in the middle of a speech by Boromir. But of these words none of us could understand anything, until we learnt, after seeking far and wide, that Imladrist was the name of a far northern dale, called by men in the north Rivendell, where Elrond the half-elven dwelt. But the rest shall now be made clear to you, said Trotter, standing up. He drew forth his sword and cast it upon a table before Boromir, in 2 pieces. Here is the sword that was broken, and I am the bearer. But who are you, and what have you or it to do with Minas Tirith? Asked Boromir. He is Aragorn, son of Celegorn, descended in right line through many fathers from Isildur of Minas Ithil, son of Elendil, said Elrond. He is Tarkil, and one of the few now left of that people. At this point, there was a mark of insertion for another passage. And the men of Minas Tirith drove out my fathers, said Aragorn. Is that not remembered, Boromir? The men of that town have never ceased to wage war on Sauron, but they have listened not seldom to counsels that came from him. In the days of Valandur, they murmured against the men of the West, and rose against them, and when they came back from battle with Sauron, they refused them entry into the city. Then Valandur broke his sword before the city gates and went away north, and for long the heirs of Elendil dwelt in Osferod, the Northburg, in slowly waning glory and darkening days. But all the Northland has now long been waste, and all that are left of Elendil's folk, few. What do the men of Minas Tirith want with me? To return to aid them in the war and then reject me at the gates again? They did not bid me to make any request, said Boromir, and asked only for the meaning of the words. Yet we are sorely pressed, and if Minas Tirith falls in the land of Ond, a great region will fall under the shadow. I will come, said Trotter, for the half-high have indeed set forth, and the spoken days are near. Boromir looked at Frodo and nodded with sudden understanding. The text ends here. This passage was struck through in pencil. Hurled onto the page, this narrative is only one stage advanced from the highly provisional outlines which my father made at various points as the work proceeded. I think that this obscure story, with its notable suggestion of a subject population that was not Númenórean, though the cities were founded by Elendil, was rejected almost as soon as written. It may be that it was the earliest form of the history of the Númenórean realms in exile that my father conceived. In these earliest workings, it is interesting to see that the sword that was broken existed before the story that it was broken beneath Elendil as he fell. Indeed, it is not clear that at first it was indeed Elendil's sword, nor how Valandur, whose sword it was related to him, though it seems plain that he was a direct descendant of Elendil. Very possibly, he was to be Isildur's son. So, a few interesting plot points here. We get a different backstory for the sword that was broken, but more importantly, we get a completely different story for Gondor and Minas Tirith. We know from my earlier reading that the canonical version of the history is that once there was no obvious successor to the throne, the stewards, who were also originally of Númenórean descent, assumed leadership of Gondor. In this version, the people of Minas Tirith, a, quote, subject population that was not Númenórean, rebelled against their Númenórean king while he was away fighting Sauron. When he returned, they barred the gates, and so in response, he broke the sword, a symbol of his leadership, and took his Númenórean followers north. Hence, given that storyline, Boromir's claim to rule as a steward clashes much more with Aragorn's claim. And we're going to see some fireworks come about because of it. Note also that it's strongly implied that the rebellion was instigated by Sauron himself. We get the line, "The men of that town never ceased to wage war on Sauron, but they have listened not seldom to counsels that came from him." So the story continues. We're going to pick it up in Lothlórien. The text mentions a map feature called the Angle. There are a couple of places known as the Angle, but I think what they're talking about here is the southeastern corner of Lothlórien. And this is where Boromir is going to attempt to take the ring, as opposed to Amon Hen, which is the location in the final version. Reach Lothlórien December 15th. Take refuge up trees. Elves befriend them, December 15th, 16th, 17th, they journey to Angle, between Anduin and Blackroot. There they remain long. While they are up trees, orcs go by, also Gollum. At Angle they debate what is to be done. Frodo feels it is his duty to go straight to Fire Mountain. But Aragorn and Boromir wish to go to Minas Tirith, and if possible, gather force. Frodo sees that that will not help, as Minas Tirith is still a long way from Fire Mountain, and Sauron will only be the more warned. Boromir is secretly planning to use the ring, since Gandalf is gone. Boromir takes Frodo apart and talks to him, begs to see Ring again. Evil enters into his heart, and he tries to daunt Frodo and then take it by force. Frodo is obliged to slip it on to escape him. What does he see then? Cloud all around him getting nearer and many fell voices in the air? Frodo, seeing that evil has entered into the company, dare not stay and does not want to imperil hobbits or others. He flies. His loss is not discovered for some time because of Boromir's lies. Boromir says he has climbed a tree and will be coming back soon? The hunt eventually fails because Frodo went a long way invisible. Owing to Boromir's treachery and Frodo's use of Ring, the hunt fails. Merry and Pippin are distracted by loss of Sam and Frodo. They themselves get lost following echoes. They fall in with Treebeard and his 3 giants. Legolas and Gimli also get captured by Saruman? One chapter, inside Minas Tirith. Aragorn began to suspect Boromir at the time of the loss of Frodo. A sudden change seems to come over Boromir. He is anxious to go away home at once and not look for Frodo. Minas Tirith is besieged by Sauron's forces that have crossed Anduin at Osgiliath, and by Saruman, who has come up in rear. There seems no hope. Evil has now got complete hold of Boromir. The Lord of Minas Tirith is slain. They choose Aragorn as chief. Boromir is jealous and enraged. He deserts and seeks off to Saruman, seeking his aid in getting lordship. At this point, the siege must be broken by Gandalf with Legolas and Gimli and by Treebeard. But not too much fighting, or it will spoil last battle of Gorgoroth. Gandalf might simply walk through the lines, or else have a contest with Saruman. Bring on the wizard's duel! Woohoo! I'm all for it. Okay, so this is where we see a very different Boromir. We see him lie about Frodo's absence. Says he climbed a tree. In the final version, he admits to the company that Frodo put the ring on and vanished. And I love the exchange he has with Aragorn. "Is that all you have to say?" said Aragorn, looking hard and not too kindly at Boromir. "Yes," he answered. "I will say no more. Yet." Ooh, that leads up to the redemption moment. But in this earlier draft, Tolkien is planning an entire chapter on Boromir and Aragorn at Minas Tirith. Looks like Tolkien has accelerated the events leading up to the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Sauron and Saruman are laying siege to Minas Tirith, and Denethor has died. Aragorn is chosen as the new chief ahead of Boromir. Jealousy pushes Boromir to join Saruman. Christopher Tolkien further writes, "Boromir would play a shameful part, treacherously fleeing to Saruman in his hatred for Aragorn, chosen to be successor for the slain lord of Minas Tirith." He also adds, "a faint adumbration of Wormtongue?" That is, in fact, the first time I've ever used adumbration in a sentence. Just to confirm, I looked it up, and yes, it essentially means foreshadowing. So Christopher is showing us that this version of Boromir gets morphed into the role of Grima Wormtongue, who betrays Rohan for Saruman. And now we're going to jump to the end of this draft. How does the story end for this version of Boromir? Very interesting. After fall of Mordor, they return to Minas Tirith. Feast. Aragorn comes to meet them. Aragorn looks out and sees moon rise over Minas Morgul. He remains behind and becomes Lord of Minas Ithil. What about Boromir? Does he repent? Written later in margin, no. Slain by Aragorn. Wow! Instead of weeping over his fallen comrade, in this draft, Aragorn is forced to kill Boromir, presumably in some form of combat. I like that Tolkien is asking himself this question. Does he repent? And the answer, written in the margin, nope. So, as I mentioned, we get this dramatic evolution of the character of Boromir, from out-and-out villain to tragic hero. And in my opinion, the story is much better for it. I enjoy seeing these glimpses of Tolkien's writing process. I think a lot of people, including myself, think of Tolkien as having created the story. He knew exactly what he wanted to do from the beginning, and it was just a matter of writing it down. But no, he was making significant changes to the story throughout. And it's a credit to his genius that his creativity and his intelligence led him to refine these characters in this sweeping, epic series of storylines into the tale we know and love. Creating The Lord of the Rings required thousands of choices on behalf of the author, and he pretty much nailed every single one of them, including his choice to redeem Boromir of the Fellowship. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye! Wow! Sounds funny.